A very good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Institute of South Asian Studies and the Energy Studies Institute panel discussion titled Energy Cooperation in South Asia. Before we proceed with the event, we would appreciate if you could mute your microphones and video throughout the session. We would also appreciate if you could forward us your questions via this chat to the moderator. The questions will be consolidated for the panelists to answer. This afternoon, we are delighted to have with us the following panelists: Dr. Mirza Sadakat Huda, Postdoctoral Research Fellow, OSCE Academy in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan; Dr. Mohammed Masudur Rahman, Department of Economics, the University of Waikato, New Zealand; and Dr. S. Narayan, Senior Visiting Research Fellow, Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS, and former Economic Advisor to the Prime Minister of India. I shall now invite Dr. Christopher Len, Senior Research Fellow, Energy Studies Institute, to moderate the panel discussion. Dr. Len, please.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this ISAS-ESI panel discussion titled Energy Cooperation in South Asia. This panel will try to address four basic questions. First, what is the current state of play in terms of energy cooperation in the region? Second, what are the barriers to greater cooperation between the different countries? Third, what is the cost of non-cooperation? And finally, what is the way forward? So the region is home to 1/5 of the world's population. At the same time, it is one of the world's least integrated regions, not just in terms of energy, but in terms of trade as well. So energy shortfall in the region is affecting economic and development plans of the countries there. Specifically, there is an electricity shortfall. There's a World Bank report citing data from 2016, which estimated that there are over 250 million people living off the grid. And that's more than a quarter of the global population without access to electricity. And one of the key challenges for the region is the need to balance between enabling universal access for the population versus getting towards sustainable energy access. This is not an either-or kind of a challenge, but the need to think about the sustainable dimension when developing the energy profile of the different countries adds another layer of complexity for the governments. So I don't want to take up too much time talking. And today we have three speakers. The first speaker, as introduced by Dr. Roshni already, is Dr. Mirza Huda. And he's going to start this panel by talking on energy cooperation in South Asia. And his title is Overcoming Challenges to Energy Cooperation in South Asia. So Dr. Huda, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dr. Len. Thank you very much, Dr. Len. So I'd just like to start off by saying thanks to the Institute of South Asian Studies and the Energy Studies Institute for organizing a discussion on this very important topic. So my presentation is on overcoming challenges to energy cooperation in South Asia. And essentially, my presentation is based on a book that I recently published, which is titled Energy Cooperation in South Asia, Utilizing Natural Resources for Peace and Sustainable Development, and was published by Routledge in April 2020. And so this book essentially tried to answer one very important research question. So I tried to examine the challenges to energy cooperation and the associated policy responses. And to bring in the policy importance of this topic, I did case studies on 4 cross-border energy projects, and I used various international relations theories. So I looked at the MBI pipeline, the Myanmar, Bangladesh, India pipeline, through the conceptual lens of energy diplomacy. I also looked at hydroelectric projects between Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, and Nepal through environmental peacebuilding. And I looked at cooperative security as it relates to the Tipaimuk Dam between India and Bangladesh. So I'd just like to briefly describe the current state of regional energy cooperation. So in the last 7 years, there has been an exponential increase in the pace of regional cooperation in South Asia. So currently there are more than 15 bilateral energy projects being undertaken, and 4 multilateral projects are at various stages of negotiation or construction. And so in that slide there, I have highlighted some of the milestones of energy cooperation in the last 7 years. I won't deliberate through all of them. So essentially, very briefly, in the last 7 years, we witnessed the very first cross-border transmission line being constructed between India and Bangladesh. In 2016, there was the inauguration of the Tapi pipeline, an inauguration of the very first multilateral gas pipeline in South Asia. And last year, the very first cross-border pipeline in South Asia was actually completed. And this was a pipeline that transferred refined petroleum from India to Nepal. And also last year, the very first multilateral hydroelectric project was being intensely discussed and negotiated upon, and a power purchase agreement on the very first multilateral hydroelectric project was signed between India, Bangladesh, and Nepal on the 900 megawatt Upper Karnali project in Nepal. But one of the milestones that I would really like to stress upon is the updating of the guidelines on cross-border electricity trade by the Ministry of Power of India in 2018. So the guidelines of the Ministry of Power of India were actually updated to facilitate multilateral cooperation. And this is a huge boost to regional cooperation in South Asia, because traditionally one of the biggest impediments to energy cooperation in the region has been India's reluctance to engage in multilateral cooperation. And so by updating its guidelines to facilitate trilateral cooperation, India is essentially sending a signal to Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Nepal that not only will it facilitate multilateral cooperation, it will actually lead energy cooperation in the region. And so this is a milestone that is actually represented at the policy level. So it goes beyond rhetoric. So despite the progress, the research that I undertook revealed that there are quite a few challenges to energy cooperation. And so when I first started my research, I found out that in every study on energy, whether it be academic studies or policy reports published by the World Bank or the Asia Development Bank, the biggest challenge to energy cooperation is often perceived to be political challenges. So political challenges are given primacy over technical, economic, financial, any other challenges. But these political challenges are often not explained beyond very simplistic references to the India-Pakistan conflict or Indian hegemony. Something very very superficial. So at the first stage of research, I tried to understand what these political challenges are. And to do this, I undertook 6 months of fieldwork in India, Bangladesh, and Nepal. And I interviewed a whole range of policymakers. And I also interviewed policymakers in Pakistan through Skype. And so the general findings on political challenges was that these challenges were not confined to geopolitics, but a lot of these challenges were related to the failure of political leadership in multiple realms. So, for instance, one of the primary challenges to energy cooperation is domestic politics and how this impacts energy cooperation. So, the domestic political actors in many of the countries of South Asia act in ways that undermine cooperation. So, in some of the smaller countries of South Asia, politicians in the opposition often undermine cooperation with India by engaging in nationalistic rhetoric. And in the larger countries of India and Pakistan, many political actors and fringe political actors, many radical groups undermine cooperation through nationalistic rhetoric. And this is one of the biggest challenges to the completion of energy projects. Then there's the issue of extra-regional actors. We saw how the recent conflict between India and China can throw the whole region into chaos. And very often, the rivalries between extra-regional actors can undermine existing initiatives to undertake energy cooperation in South Asia. For example, several multilateral projects are being planned in the Ganges-Brahmaputra-Meghna basin between Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, and Nepal. And China actually occupies 18% of the Ganges-Brahmaputra-Meghna basin, which means that any sort of conflict between China and India can essentially undermine hydroelectric cooperation between the BBIN. Then there's the issue of communication of energy cooperation. So one of the energy experts that I interviewed in India told me that she feels that politicians have not communicated the benefits of regional energy cooperation in the correct manner. So the emphasis of energy cooperation has always been around energy security, but there has been not much association between energy cooperation and energy access. So as Dr. Len correctly mentioned, there's more than 250 million people in the region who don't have access to electricity. So politicians have not linked this issue or the issue of socioeconomic development and how they can be resolved through energy cooperation. So the rhetoric has always been around national security and energy security. And lastly, a former director at the SARC Energy Center that I interviewed told me that one of the primary concerns of regional energy cooperation is how this can be undermined by exploitative practices. So unfortunately, the countries of South Asia rank quite low when it comes to the Corruption Perceptions Index. And there has been some very high-profile cases of corruption in the energy sector in South Asia. So if corruption is also undertaken in transnational energy projects, then this will undermine the sustainable development objective of these projects. And there are also huge environmental and human rights challenges of energy cooperation in South Asia. So one of the findings of my research was that there is a discrepancy in the perception of the costs and benefits of environmental impacts of transnational hydroelectric projects. So what I'm trying to say is that the countries that are going to export hydroelectricity, like Nepal and Bhutan, put a lot of emphasis on the environmental costs that their countries will have to bear, whereas in India and Bangladesh, who are going to import the electricity, they don't necessarily recognize these costs. So, for example, if there is a regional hydroelectric project in Nepal, which transfers electricity to India and Bangladesh, this will result in flooding in Nepal. And there is not much recognition of this cost in the countries that are importing electricity. And this can really cause some deadlocks in negotiation when it comes to regional hydroelectric projects. So there needs to be a mechanism of calculating the correct costs and benefits of regional hydroelectric cooperation. And lastly, energy projects and infrastructure projects more broadly has resulted in huge human rights violations in South Asian countries at the domestic level. And this issue can be exacerbated to a great extent when it comes to transnational projects. And this is one of the concerns that were raised by the policymakers that I interviewed. So there needs to be a recognition of the impacts of energy projects as it relates to resettlement, livelihoods, and other socioeconomic impacts on the local population. So very quickly, I will just go through the policy recommendations. And once again, these are derived from interviews with the policymakers in South Asia. So one of the ways that energy cooperation can be enhanced is through the building of domestic consensus. And the issue of rhetoric and political messages is extremely important here. So for example, one of the economists that I interviewed in Nepal told me that politicians often talk about the total cost of resources, but they never talk about the benefits, the total benefits of resources. So for example, you will hear politicians talk about how a certain river has, say, 10,000, maybe 1,000 megawatts potential of hydroelectricity. And this leads to resource nationalism, because then the question is, oh, well, if it has 1,000 megawatts of hydroelectric potential, why don't we use it for the local population here? But if the rhetoric is around the socioeconomic benefits of utilizing this 1,000 megawatts of hydroelectricity, then the question comes, then the issues of cooperation, infrastructure development, benefit sharing comes in. So sending the right messages is very important in building domestic consensus for regional cooperation. And one of the other issues that I came across while speaking to policymakers in South Asia was the importance of containing spoilers of regional energy cooperation. Now, spoilers were described by an interview respondent as those who gain from the perpetuation of conflict in South Asia. So this could be certain businessmen, for example, who gain from the lack of direct trade between India and Pakistan. It could be terrorist or radical organizations, ultra-nationalist politicians. So there's a very important, it is very important to contain these spoilers and ensure that they don't harm regional energy cooperation. And also there has to be consistency in supporting multilateral cooperation. So currently we are faced with the global COVID-19 crisis and the related economic downturn. And there's a danger that the great momentum that we've witnessed in energy cooperation in the last 7 years can be affected by these. And a change in government, change in policies can often undermine great progress that has been made in energy cooperation. So there is a need to be consistent progress and a consistent political will among the leadership in South Asia to for energy projects to be finalized and completed. And lastly, it is important that energy projects in South Asia accept international standards. And this is important on several levels. So firstly, the acceptance of, for example, the International Finance Corporation's social and environmental standards will address many of the environmental and human rights concerns associated with the construction of energy projects. And also incorporating the extractive industries transparency initiative standards would address concerns related to transparency and corruption. So overall, there is a lot of potential in energy cooperation in South Asia. A lot of progresses have been made, but the political actors in the region need to be proactive in addressing some of the critical challenges that can still undermine energy cooperation in South Asia. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Huda. Congratulations on the publication of your book. And I think you made a very good point that when we talk about South Asia Energy Cooperation, people always think of it as political barriers obstructing the prospects for cooperation. But what I like about your presentation and your book is that you're trying to have a more nuanced understanding of what these barriers actually are, right? And then the other part, communication, that is also a very important factor. There is a need to reframe the issue away from this whole constant emphasis on zero-sum rivalry. And then in terms of managing spoilers, that is also kind of related to the issue of communications. Managing spoilers, managing vested interests, trying to get the social license to operate. This requires, again, a lot of effort in terms of communication. And when we talk about cooperation in South Asia, it's also important, as you have stated, that this is not just about getting the states to cooperate. To make the project meaningful and sustainable, it is also important to ensure that international standards are applied. In this way, when the project benefits the local communities, I think that will also create more momentum for projects in the future. So thank you very much for your presentation, and we will take questions at the end of the presentations by the three speakers. And right now, I would like to invite the second speaker, Dr. Muhammad Rahman, to give his presentation. And his presentation is on the cause of non-cooperation in the South Asian energy sector. So, Dr. Rahman, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christopher Lin. Thank you very much for the introduction. And thank you very much, ISAS. Very good, initiative, because South Asian energy cooperation is very important topics, but less discussed. So I'm really appreciate to arrange such kinds of panel discussion and this topic, talking about these topics. So I'll speak, starting from the private sector. So what's going on in the private sector in energy production in South Asia. So that I'll talk about a little bit. Then I just give a case study. What is the impact of tariff reduction or tariff increase on domestic production or macroeconomic impact in Bangladesh case? So that I'll talk about a little bit. And then I'll talk about the current, cross-border electricity trade among South Asian countries and what is the scenario, present scenario, and especially focus on Bangladesh-India electricity trade. So I'll talk about a little bit that one. I also touch a little bit in the cross-border electricity trade policy. You see, we have a South Asian SAARC energy framework that we have in since 2014, and India recently that Dr. Mirza mentioned. India, have a framework agreement so in export-import guideline for electricity guideline. So that is important step from India. So we talk about a little bit that one, and then what we need to do from my perspectives, I will discuss a little bit. So yes, South Asian countries, especially Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal, BBIN. So under this, these countries, the private sector is coming. So private sector producing a lot of electricity in that, in this region. That is very important. That is really very important that private sector come out. We understand there are a lot of corruption, a lot of things is there. We know we have many different types of rules, regulation is there. You know, that we understand, but it's very good initiative that private sector come out. And especially see Bhutan, they're producing a lot of electricity and exporting to India, and Bhutan, Indian investment is there. So that is also a very good sign that we have some investment, South Asian investment is there. And we also, that, Mirja, mentioned, we have also started the trading among South Asia. So Bangladesh importing from India, we have more than 1,000 megawatt we importing from India. Nepal also importing, Nepal also exporting. I just reading, Nepal, electricity authorities paper, their report, that they're also exporting sometimes, in India. That is important sign. And also, of course, Bhutan exporting to India. So that's mean we have started trading among this region. That is important sign, and I appreciate that one. But it's still that, our access to electricity is very lower compared to the rest of the world. And if particularly I focus on rural South Asia, Bangladesh, and except Bhutan, everybody, we are lacking, we don't have power, we are blackout. So still we have a big problem. And especially you see the Bangladesh, we importing 6% of our electricity, but still we have a lot of, need for electricity. And according to our master plan 2016 that JICA prepared, by 2030, we need double our electricity. So we need a huge capacity to produce electricity. We need huge investment, and also the cost of production. You see the cost of production, except nuclear power or hydro, other cost is very high. So we need to find out some other way, because by 2030, if you need 40,000 megawatt electricity, how can we manage this one? So this is important issues, not only the production, also transmission, distribution, so a lot of issues there. So I prepared, very briefly, what would be the impact of if we increase the electricity by 20%, or if we decrease the electricity tariff by 20%, what would be the economic impact? Because sometimes, this information, the economic benefit, is not transmitted to the politician. They don't understand actually what is the real benefit. So that's why it needs to be very clear understanding. If we increase 20% our tariff, electricity price, what would be the impact on GDP? If we reduce 20%, what would be the impact on GDP? So I try to calculate, using my GTAP model. It is an extended version of GTAP model, and where I incorporated Bangladesh SAM social accounting matrix using GTAP version 10 database. I'm not, discussing the methodology here. If you want to ask me, during the Q&A session, I will discuss methodology. But I just try to, here similar to scenario. If we increase 20% price of our tariff, our electricity in Bangladesh, what would be the economic impact? And if you decrease 20% of tariff, what would be the economic impact? So you see here, based on this GTAP, my GTAP, this extended version of GTAP, so where I incorporated Bangladesh social accounting matrix, those who is collected from SANEM, and if we increase 20%, our tariff, the electricity price, of course here the price, electricity price, electricity tariff is different for different sector, like industrial sector, residential sector different. But I make it in general, but make it simple and just make an assumption all are same. This is not same. I just shock the 20% same for every sector. So if you increase 20%, price, electricity tariff, the GDP will be decreased 1.2%. That's been $1.5 billion. And export will fall 0.7%. Import will also fall 0.5%. And if we decrease electricity price by 20% in present price 20%. Of course, here is this is a real because GTAP data is a real GDP data. So we are not considering the inflation or other issues. So 20% decrease electricity price will almost increase GDP 1%, 0.1% in Bangladesh. So which is $1.4 billion. So that is a huge. So this information maybe we need to transmit to our policymaker and to understand different stakeholders that how our electricity price impacting to our macroeconomy. And also I calculated also on production and private consumption. So and you see the impact on production, of course, on agriculture, electricity, industrial sector will be huge. So huge negative impact. And of course, on private consumption also is negative impact. So that is important for our, to understanding how we need to shape our cooperation. Okay, then I'll talk about little bit major cross-border transmission in South Asia. Particularly, I focus on Bangladesh, India, and Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Bangladesh, Nepal. So you see, the media already discussed, we are importing 1,160 megawatt from India through these two channels. One is from Bharamara and Berhampur, that transmission line. Another is from Kumilla Tripura line. So that is that we started, that we are importing from India. It's a good sign for us that we have started our cross-border trading. Also, Bhutan exporting India, and Bhutan is very ambitious. They want to export 10,000 megawatt to India. So that's very important and very good initiative. Also, Nepal and India has many different interconnection line, 12 different interconnection line. India, Sri Lanka, they're also talking, and for submarine cable and other different types of cooperation. Pakistan, India also they are under negotiation and under discussion also. That is fine. And also so Bangladesh, that means Bangladesh, India, Bhutan, Nepal, India, Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka. So we are now in the cross-border electricity trade arena. That's fine. And also Bangladesh, not only direct from the government, also the private sector. So the private sector, that's mean through the competitive bidding process, they are importing and they are signing long-term agreement and trading between these two countries. So in South Asian electricity trade is booming now. And that is our requirement, that we need actually. But what happened, the policy? If you see, I try to summarize different types of policy like Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal, and except Indian, this recent policy guideline for import-export of electricity 2018, except this one, a clear, explicit trade policy, electricity trade policy is missing. So that's a good sign. And under this, this guideline now, India, allowed to like Nepal and Bangladesh, maybe Bangladesh and Nepal can do also trade. So this guideline helps us to move forward. So that's good. But how about the other country? Maybe we need a very explicit trade policy particularly for electricity trade policy for this region. So that is missing in this region. So in India, I appreciate India that they actually prepared this guideline. So and I also talk about a little bit SAARC framework agreement for energy cooperation. It's 1914, and if you see there's 20 articles, and Article 9, 12, and 13 is good because this is give you access of transmission service, also facilitating export buying and selling. So that is, it's fine, but it's 2014. After that, is there any trade and investment agreement? No. Any other kinds of tariff or other investment issues is ignored. How about the rules regulation? Domestic rules regulation is also missing. So maybe we need to move forward, and updated and upgraded this framework agreement, or move to the trade and investment electricity agreement. Okay, and my last slide, I propose a few issues. One is national focal point, because we know we have a SARC energy centered, but SARC energy centered, we need a focal point. If you want to talk with someone from this particular country, whom to you to discuss? Who is responsible for this? Is there any responsible person, responsible authority that under this regulation, they are bound, some kinds of bounding to talk and give information to you? There's no such kinds of, focal point or something like this. So under SARC, energy center, maybe we can establish a national focal point. They are supposed to speak, on this, and they give information, keep all this information, database, all these things. We have SARC, data portal, but if you see, it's not an interactive portal at all. I have gone through this, and I can't, get any actually real information there. So if you see some other kinds of trade portal, ITC, trade map, this kinds of trade portal, or UNCTAD trade portal, so they're very interactive, very good information, very good database there. But here, no. So we need to upgrade these kinds of trade portal, or data portal for energy sector in South Asia. And of course, this framework agreement is, is a good initiative, but now we need to update this agreement, and we need to move forward. We need to prepare a regional trade agreement in energy cooperation, or investment agreement in energy cooperation. That is important. That we need to move forward. And rules regulation, of course, because different types of rules regulation in different country. India is prepared recent guideline on export-import electricity. That is fine, and maybe other countries could follow and maybe take some initiative. And other issues is, I want to talk about the investment issues, because energy sector needs a huge investment, and there's no mechanism for this. Not only the South Asian SARC framework agreement, no other agreement. So we need a framework agreement where we talk about the investment issue in South Asia. Mm. So yes, in addition to this, we also need to, under this focal point, maybe we need to develop some kinds of technical, regional, and meeting every frequently, and focus on in South Asian energy, not only the trade goods and services, but also especially focus on energy sector. So I finished my time, I think 15 minutes. Thank you very much. And if you have any other question, then I will come back to you later.
Thank you very much, Dr. Raman. Very important dimension when we talk about energy cooperation. Where is the money coming from, right? And how will it be financed? So when we talk about sustainability and affordability, sustainability has two components, the environmental component, but also ability to sustain this certain investments over a long period of time. So when we talk about affordability and the funding for these projects, there are a lot of issues that actually comes up, right? One aspect is the question of public-private partnerships. Another question that always comes up is, in general, not just for this region, is the question of subsidies or the liberalization of the market. What's the best way to have the energy market working? And then the other one is the investment framework. It's important to have an investment framework in order to facilitate investors to come into the market, right? And availability of data, another very important point that you have raised. They need the data so that people can understand the market potential. And final point that I liked, which you mentioned, is the need for greater engagement between the different countries, not just at the political level, but at the bureaucratic technical level, so that they can have a better understanding of each other's energy sector and to have a common purpose on how to harmonize their regulations to expand the market, to make it more appealing for investors to enter. So thank you very much for your presentation. Before I move on to the next speaker, something I want you to think about for the Q&A is with regards to the issue of access to international finance. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about this area later on. There's a lot of talk about green bonds, green finance. It would be good to have a sense of how all these discussions are playing out in the South Asian context. So thank you very much. And now I will move to the next speaker, Dr. Narayan, who's a senior visiting research fellow at ICES. And he's going to talk about energy cooperation in South Asia, challenges in regulatory architecture and policy. So Dr. Narayan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christopher, and thank you, ICES, for having me on this panel. Thank you very, very, very much. What I would like to do in the time available is to kind of look at the overarching regulatory and environmental framework for making this energy cooperation possible. And I'd like to first draw a distinction between oil and power. And depending on the time available, I'll tell you why this distinction is necessary. Because in terms of supply, demand, pricing, availability, everything, these two are very, very different boxes to be dealt with. Just to take off from what, just give me 1 second, just give me 1 second. I'm sorry. So, if you look at South Asia as a whole, we are looking at energy consumption of close to about 7 kilowatt hour per capita, which is about 1/10 of what's happening in the EU. And there's a huge opportunity and a need to increase it. But South Asia Energy Cooperation, if you look at it in 2020, you know, in a little bit it's getting truncated. If you look at Pakistan, where energy demand is doubling, Pakistan has decided to go substantially with the China-funded policy of the, whatever is the border, ODD border initiative. And they're going substantially into coal power stations. These stations are meant for, so in a way, the costs as well as the debt financing, as well as the availability is going to be limited to Pakistan. So I don't see Pakistan collaborating with the rest of South Asia anymore in terms of energy, that is power exchange. Then you come down to Sri Lanka, again you have a situation where there is very little, because of the islanding of that country, very little opportunity for cooperation in terms of power cooperation between these two countries. So in the power sector, when you're talking about, you're essentially talking about India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, perhaps extended to Myanmar. And the basic distinction between power and oil is that in this region that we are talking about, it is possible to have an integrated power system where supply and demand can easily be matched, because certainly Nepal, Bhutan and Myanmar are also where there is enough generation capacity possible in India, and it is possible to have an integrated framework which would enable cross-border movement of electricity at mutually agreed prices, times, etc., easily possible. Oil is a different picture. Oil does not need this integrated harmonization, because the pricing of oil, the quantity and the pricing of oil can be determined separately by each country, taxed separately, refined separately. The pattern of consumption can vary from country to country, whereas in electricity, it's a single product which is being commonly used by all the countries, so it's much more a harmonious product than oil. So let's look at power. The existing agreements so far are agreements which are bilateral. Bilateral agreements in terms of the India-Bangladesh, India-Nepal, India-Bhutan, and as just was pointed out, there are a few trilateral agreements which are coming up of pass-through power. But if you look at the construct of these agreements, they are all constructed around PPEs, that is on power purchase agreements, and power purchase agreements which are confined to that particular source and that particular supply. So let us just look at the inefficiencies of this system. That means you are having for each contract a purchaser and a seller, or a purchaser, a transmitter and a seller, and each place you are adding financial risks, transmission risks, regulatory risks. If we had to turn it around and say, instead of doing it this way, if we could have a harmonized transmission regulatory pricing system, which could be signed off by all the countries which are going to share this, we would end up with a system where free transmission of electricity, instead of source to supply, it could be grid to grid, which is a totally different picture. You do not have to identify a single source of supply, but the entire grid could be shared. So what I'm really talking about is an architecture which could harmonize the entire electricity system in the whole of the South Asian, when I call the South Asian region in electricity, I'm just meaning these four countries. And that is that, in a way, the regulations, the trade regulations that both the speakers pointed out, the 2019 trade regulations that have been put out. These trade regulations attempt to provide a regulatory framework whereby this could be possible. Now it is up to each country to accept it. Please consider the risks. Just now, the cost of power, how critical it is in Bangladesh was just now pointed out. The variations in costs of power in India would determine the availability and non-availability of power, particularly in the rural areas. Nepal and Bhutan would largely be considered as exporting countries, and therefore the price negotiation at that point becomes extremely important. So there are commercial risks, there are financial risks, there are political and regulatory risks to this integration. And therefore, I come back to the point that instead of looking at power generation, which is again a very big environmental issue, as Mirza Huda pointed out, to more a transmission harmonization regulation, which means make sure that there is an integrated transmission network which would be possible to move the power from any of the generating stations to any of the generating countries and fit in with local, I would say, costs and local risk mitigation measures, so that everybody gets the same price and the same price of electricity at the distribution point. Okay, this may be a bit of a wish, a bit of a pipe dream, but unless this happens, regional integration in electricity, in power, is unlikely to happen in South Asia. What would happen is many more bits of bilateral and trilateral agreements which are supply-demand combinations. And you would have different power tariffs for each of these contracts, and the amalgamation of these power tariffs into a single harmonized entity would increasingly become more difficult as we have more and more stations coming in for generation. So this is a thought that we are at a cusp where the integration of regulations is the most important criterion. In the 2-3 minutes available to me, I'll just move to the oil sector. Here the story is very different, because in the power sector, we are talking of a supply-demand situation which can be balanced within South Asia. These 4 countries can provide resources to each other and also provide a balanced grid management capability to each other. Oil is not like that. The entire South Asian region is entirely an oil importing country, oil importing region, and will continue to remain so. So the demand for oil is determined by the demand for growth in each of these countries. So, and also the refining capacity, because it's crude oil which is going to be pumped in. Here, it is not the pricing which is important, because pricing is determined by international levels, and quantities can always be contracted out. So and each country will then sell it, distribute and sell it according to its own internal pricing mechanism. So harmonization, to the extent that the power needs to be harmonized, is not really necessary. But what is much more important is that since the pipelines are going to be static and fixed on the ground and all the time, it is very important to ensure that public participation in the areas through which the pipeline is passing. There's a point made out very nicely by Dr. Huda in his book, that unless you take the stakeholders into consideration, you're never going to be risk-free, so as far as the pipeline is concerned. And the environmental hazards of taking a pipeline through 4 or 5 different countries needs to be addressed ab initio before the pipeline gets laid. So here one is much more concerned about environmental concerns, whereas in the oil, in the power sector, environmental concerns in hydro, as was pointed out by my earlier speaker, is much more at the generation point and not at the consumption point. So if one wants to look at it holistically, one needs to look at just absolutely, it's not policy, it's not politics, but have we got the nuts and bolts right? I think we have a long way to go before it in this put out by the CERC is a first step in this. And if we could move along, we could move from the bottom up, we would get a much more a commercial system rather than a PPE based system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Narayan, for your very good presentation. I think, yes, it's very important to separate the different energy sectors. There's the power sector, that's very different from the fossil fuel or oil sector. And what you have told us is that the power sector remains very fragmented. There is room for integration, but there needs to be the conditions in place. In terms of the oil sector, we see the same issues beyond the political level. There are all the other issues at the different levels of community and of government that needs to be addressed basically it's about aligning a set of different challenges to ensure that cooperation can take place and for the region to become more integrated. So thank you very much, the three speakers. We have covered quite a lot of ground so far. I would like to encourage the participants to send in their questions. There is the Zoom group chat function. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat function. It will be collated and then it will be, I will then read them out. Okay, so we are still waiting. So far, seems like there are no questions yet. So perhaps I can go back to Dr. Rahman with regards to the question I posed earlier. Dr. Narayan, you might want to come in as well with regards to the question of international finance. What's the situation with regards to international finance in South Asia? So Dr. Rahman, maybe you can start.
Me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Go ahead, and I'll follow you.
Yeah. So it is a super important issues, financing basically. And if you look at, for example, Bangladesh Master Plan, Bangladesh Energy Master Plan 2016, they prepared, like supported by JICA, and they prepared like $7 billion need to investment by 2030. But how about the regional cooperation? You see why Pakistan, aligned with China, because China has a project of One Belt, One Road. Under this project, they have a huge amount of fund, for investment. Recently, this against of you can say the One Belt, One Road, the USA, Australia, and Japan, of course, in India also coming now. The initiative in the Pacific, cooperation, that is called Blue Dot Cooperation, Blue Dot, investment plan, and that under this plan they try to some investment in this region. But in South Asian countries, we have SAPTA is okay. We have South Asian agreement in service sector, but there is no clear-cut, explicit investment mechanism. And of course, we are lack of investment. Bangladesh need investment. India need investment. Bhutan need investment. So we are competing each other. We are competing each other for investment. So that is other issues. So we don't have enough fund for this. So that's why some people, some countries, they are moving to other region. So if you have some sort of agreement, so you see, we have SAARC framework agreement in energy sector, but there is nothing talk about investment issues. So we need to talk about this investment, and we need to figure out, how we can manage this. And maybe we need to sign some sort of, not like bilateral, because India, of course, the big player, and they have some investment, and they importing, from Bhutan, that's fine. But the clear-cut, long-term investment strategy to deal with this, that is, we need to, clearly talk about in our, group meeting or working group meeting or ministerial meeting or technical group meeting, and give some framework, some kinds of guideline that we want to do by 2030, by 2040. So that is essential. And that's why I suggest develop a national focal point. This is a binding focal point, and this focal point, they develop their country's need and submit to the, the energy center or ministry or ministerial meeting, and they can finalize some sort of investment strategy for South Asian countries.
Just to come in, when you talk about international financing for cross-border projects, you're looking at several different kinds of risk. There is first the financial risks. There's a funding risk. Where is the fund going to come from? There is always the exchange rate risk because you are going across 3 or 4 different currencies, and who are market determined currency prices. So when the payment comes up, there's an exchange rate risk. And finally, every financier would collect money from different sources. So there's a source risk. Who is going to pay for all this? And every financier would look at the commercial risk. And what are the commercial risks? Continuity of supply. Somebody has to ensure that the project works all the time because then only it generates revenue. There's a pricing risks in the sense that different countries cannot suddenly arbitrarily increase or decrease prices because that affects the repayment schedule. And finally, most importantly, there's a payment risk. If there's a failure in payment, how do you ensure that payment is, that means that there has to be a sovereign guarantee at each level. Given all this, a financier would like to look at a system where cross-border movements are smooth and well integrated. Because if he is looking at discontinuities at each border, having to negotiate the payments from each country separately, look at risks of financial risks and exchange risks at each country, I don't think you'll come up with any financial risks. But on the other hand, if you go to a financier with a proposal like a World Bank, ADB, International, or the bank, etc., with a proposal where all these things are harmonized, I think money is available. I think funds would be available because then it would be a win-win situation with the demand taken care of and supply taken care of, pricing taken care of, as well as payments taken care of. So I think the question of international financing is a question of harmonization of rules and regulations for the generation, transmission, and payment across all these 4 countries.
Thank you very much. Dr. Huda, is there anything you'd like to say about this topic? No?
Thank you, Dr. Len. So essentially, I just wanted to make a comment on the informative issues raised by Dr. Naren and Dr. Rahman. So in terms of international financing of transnational projects, I did a little bit of study on the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, which is a multilateral pipeline between Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey. And this was a pipeline constructed by BP and financed by the World Bank. Some of the finance was through the World Bank. And I just wanted to raise the issue that financing goes a little bit beyond just the monetary issues. So the financer in question of a transnational project can actually influence many of the challenges mentioned by Dr. Narayan and also in my presentation before, as they relate to environmental and human security issues. So, for example, because the World Bank got involved in the BTC pipeline, they insisted on IFC standards. So, as the financer insisted on IFC standards, BP had to ensure and in turn had to monitor the activities of the national companies in Azerbaijan, in Georgia, and Turkey to make sure that they did not in any way cause environmental harm or did not resettle people without adequate compensation. So yes, the issue of financing in itself is very complex, but getting the right financer to get involved in your project can have multiple positive impacts, through the pipeline of the project.
Sorry, just to step in, totally agree with Dr. Huda. My comments are on the basis of the power sector, oil sector is comparatively easier because the prices are internationally determined. The flow and consumption can be easily measured. Payment mechanism and stoppage mechanism, that means we don't pay, you can stop the flow, and these are easy to put into place. So the risk mitigation opportunities in an oil pipeline are very much more than in a power transmission. You can't suddenly stop power from flowing, but you can suddenly stop oil from flowing. So yes, I would find that it is easier to get financing for oil projects than for power projects, power transmission projects.
Thank you very much. Yes, international finance in itself is a very broad topic. I mean, there are the different sectors, and actually when we talk about international finance, there are also many layers from the institutions, the international institutions, and then kind of in the background, there are various different actors involved as well. You know, you can have the banks, the advisory companies, there's the insurance component, possibly there are the venture capitalists looking for potential opportunities with various companies. So it's a very broad topic. But I think a common thread when you have outside investors looking at the region, looking for investment opportunities, there is first the requirement for harmonization of regulations, particularly when we talk about cross-border issues. The second one is with regards to the ESG component, right? Now ESG, which refers to the environmental, social, and corporate governance dimension, that is also a very important dimension these investors look at beyond the so-called international level political risk. So there's still a lot of things and dimensions to look into with regards to this topic. And I thank all three speakers for their response. And now we have some questions from the chat box. I will go to the first question first. First question is, how can we facilitate greater levels of energy cooperation in South Asia while keeping issues such as climate change and initiatives such as sustainable goals in mind? Yes, this is a very important topic. We have been talking about energy access, energy cooperation, and actually in this framework, there is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal. We always talk about sustainable goal SDG 7, which is affordable and clean energy, which is to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. But in this context, it's always good to look at it, keeping in mind goal number 8, which is about decent work and economic growth. This growth needs to be inclusive, right? And then also goal number 9, climate action. So this is a very good question because it's kind of like a triangle. In providing energy access, there's the economic dimension and there's the environmental dimension. So I wonder if any of the speakers would like to say something. Anyone?
Yeah.
Yes, Dr.
Yeah, I think this is a really super important issue he raised, because MDG 7, 8, 9. So this is the important, and we all are, care about this. But problem, you just mentioned this investment issues as previous, question was also similar to issues. Like one issue is for long-term clean energy. And of course, reasonable and affordable. Because it's an energy sector or power sector, we need a long-term investment. For example, Bangladesh importing 15 years contract, 25 years contract, 2 different contracts. One is 15 years, one is 25 years. So yes, it's a long-term contract. So this is one is positive dig, one is negative dig. It's a long-term. So you have a long-term time to return your investment, and you can be business in the long time. At the same time, because we need to think about our MDG and other goals. You see, recently we have different types of problem in Bangladesh. India tried to invest, in some part of Bangladesh, it's a mangrove area, and there's a huge environmental issues is there. So we need to some sort of trade-off between this environmental issue and economic issues, and we need to openly discuss this issue, and we need to solve these issues, because we can just blindly blame to each other, but we need to bring out in front of us clearly and reasonably, and we need to solve these issues for our future. So yes, we need to deal with this climate change, we need to deal with the environmental issues, and then we need to move forward. Of course, this has a lot of cost for that, but we cannot ignore this. We have to deal with this, and that is our priority. And Bangladesh, like India, Nepal, Bhutan, we all are suffering these kinds of climate change, and now we have other issues is there. And if you are not work together, if you do not have any cooperation, we will face same problem each other. So we need a common ground, we need a common cooperation among this region and solve this problem together. Thank you.
Dr. Narayan, would you like to say some? Oh, Dr. Huda, did you want to say something first?
Yeah. No, I think it's a very, very important question. Actually, Dr. Huda has addressed it to some extent in his book, I am aware. But again, I separate the power and the oil side here. The power side has serious environmental concerns at the supply end, because we are talking substantially of hydro-based power exchange, and hydro-based power leads to displacement, leads to degradation of whatever is the natural habitat there, and therefore I do think that in every power sector exchange sharing program, we should have a very, very detailed environmental impact assessment and make sure that the livelihoods of the people who are getting displaced need to be protected and actually taken care of for a long time. Okay, so it's very easy to say it in English, but much more difficult to actually implement in practice. But I think ecologically sensitive as well as I would say large displacement projects should just not be taken up at all, because there are enough projects without that, and you should pick up the low-hanging fruits where the ecological sensitivity is low and physical damage is also comparatively low. Oil, the big risk. Big risks is, of course, the spill. Of course, the spill. And spill cannot be managed just by insurance and just by removal. And spill will continue to be a very, very big risk in a pipeline. So whatever kind of extra safety mechanisms that need to be put into the pipeline, even if they are enormous additional costs, must be factored in right at the beginning itself to make sure that there is no ecological or environmental damage to that. I'm sure Dr. Huda can add to what I'm saying.
Dr. Huda, would you like to say something?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Narayan, for that comment. I actually have more of a question for you. Sorry, this is such a great learning experience for me. Recently I had a conversation with an energy expert from ASEAN, and he said that that when it comes to deciding between economic development and environmental protection, it is important to consider what he called bridging energy resources. So essentially, resources like gas that are not as dirty as coal, but not necessarily as expensive as renewable energy, or I would say not as revolutionary as changing all our systems to renewable energy. So do you think that gas and hydroelectricity, provided that they are not as clean as 100% renewable energy, can they play the role of South Asia slowly transitioning to 100% renewable energy in the future? So can they be like a bridging resource for the region?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I mean, all three of us, we forgot to talk about gas at all. In fact, gas is to my mind, a very, very important and a much more positive alternative, because now huge gas resources are being found all over the world, Australia, everywhere. And gas is comparatively a much cleaner fuel, much more controllable fuel in the sense that technological capability of gas flows, gas management, gas distribution management are so high that you can actually locate even a small leak at the consumer end and make sure that that is plugged. So I would call this gas as among these three. I mean, between oil and gas, certainly gas would score very much higher. And India is going towards more and more gas, except that a lot of pipeline has to be laid, distribution pipelines have to be laid. But I would switch from gas. The next alternative I would say is renewable energy. And renewable energy in terms of wind and solar, the only point is that that's seasonal, so it cannot have a base load effect, which gas can. But renewable energy in India, the solar efforts are becoming quite significant. We didn't expect that we would have, I don't know the numbers as of today, but I mean, we thought we would do 3 megawatts or something by 2015, and we are far ahead of that. We are around 20 GW or more, and gas and solar is galloping ahead. So I do see this as an alternative, a cleaner alternative, and the only thing is solar requires a lot of land, and wind requires kind of particular locations. But certainly these are preferable, and then I would put power. And hydropower, as I said, the problem is at the supply end and not at the demand end, where you have to take care of the sustainable development goals.
Yes, that's a very good response, because there was a participant who was asking about examples of the opportunity for cooperation in the area of renewable energy in the region. So Dr. Narayan, you have kind of answered that. He was asking whether there are any specific successful projects so far, and what can the governments in the region do more to facilitate the deployment of renewable energy in the region. Dr. Narayan, maybe you have something more to say about this. Then perhaps I'll move to Dr. Rahman and then Dr. Huda. So question
only little country specific. If I go forward, I see cooperation between India and Sri Lanka happening much more, not really on the oil side and not even on the power transmission side, but certainly on the renewable energy side. I see great opportunities because now there is sufficient expertise and technology available in India because of the large amount of solar and the wind factories, I would say, generations that have come up. And Sri Lanka is a great opportunity. And once that opportunity gets converted into actual project, then moving that particular energy, if it is surplus from Sri Lanka to the southern part of India, it's just a 22 kilometer kind of cable or transmission line that is required. So maybe here's an opportunity to say, don't look at oil and coal generation from Sri Lanka to India, but look at renewable energy generation in Sri Lanka, and then whatever is surplus, move it to the southern parts of India.
Okay, Dr. Rahman, do you have anything you'd like to say with regards to renewable energy trends in South Asia?
Yeah, I think in South Asia perspective, if you see, of course, you know, the different situation here, different country. Bhutan have different situation, India has different situation. But we are lucky, we have, you know, rain, we have sunshine. If you come from if you come in this part of the world, you know, in New Zealand here, in limited sunshine. So this is actually in South Asia, we have, you know, we can use this solar or the renewable energy. But I don't know the technology at this moment. Maybe we have a lot of opportunity for cooperation, but the technology and the cooperation actually, because how you develop the project, you need a comparative advantage, and who have comparative advantage? If you have a comparative advantage, then you go for cooperation. And you see, in Bangladesh, we are producing energy, and we are paying higher cost. We're giving you subsidy, but we are importing a less, like 6% only. If you have a lower cost, why not you import from other country? And if you're spending a lot of money and your cost is very high and you're giving subsidy, this is super inefficient and distorting market. So I think we have a lot of opportunity to cooperate, not only this this area, but also in renewable energy area. So we need a very solid cooperation that we are talking, and that we are missing actually. And energy sector cooperation is less discussed, less talk about. It's always they talk about security issues, but we need a real cooperation in this area, in this sector. That I want to focus. Thank you.
Dr. Huda, is there anything you'd like to say?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Len. In regards to technology transfer, I just wanted to raise an issue regarding recent plans by both the Indian and Pakistani governments to use the area between the India-Pakistan border to build huge solar and wind farms. So this is the border between India and Pakistan, which forms the Thar Desert. So this is desert land that has huge huge acres of unused land that is being used to develop these mega solar and wind energy projects. And so one of them happens to be the Quaid-e-Azam solar plant in Pakistan. And then in Gujarat, you have the Charanka solar plant. There are many solar plants that are also being developed and planned in Rajasthan. And so these are all near the border, international border of India and Pakistan. There has been some technical exchanges between the two countries on solar technology already. So back in 2016, I think, this team of Pakistani experts actually visited India to study solar technology. So, I mean, obviously the political situation between the two countries is very, very complicated. But India has a very, very ambitious renewable energy program. The cost of solar panels is decreasing at an exponential rate. And the cost of storage is decreasing at an exponential rate in India. So given that there is close proximity between the projects being developed in India and the project being developed in Pakistan. I don't know if political situation will permit some form of technical exchanges, but it is possible, given that both countries are trying to implement renewable energy. But once again, the political issues might as well impede any kind of progress. And as Dr. Rahman said, cooperation depends on comparative perspective. So, I mean, it's all good and well to say, oh, just because both countries are developing solar plants and wind farms, they can come together and cooperate. But what is the actual basis of it? What would they gain from it? So these are issues that needs to be perhaps explored, and more research needs to be undertaken. But of course, as far as the smaller countries of South Asia are concerned, China and India are the leading markets for solar energy. So I guess, like, the small countries of South Asia would look up to these countries in terms of technological advancement and policy and other issues.
Yes, that's a very nice lead-in. We were talking about renewable energy, but actually that ties very closely to the question of technology transfer and technology cooperation. And there's actually one question there. What are the opportunities and challenges for South Asian countries in technological transfer with regards to renewable energy? So I think the speakers have kind of answered that. What I would like to add perhaps to this question is when we talk about the technology component, there are kind of like two different segments as I see it. One is with regards to the decarbonization of the electricity supply, power generation sectors. The other aspect is with regards to the transport sector. So there's also a very big field where there's a lot of room for cooperation. And I was looking through my old notes, and actually I've scribbled something with regards to international intellectual property rights. And with regards to technological transfer, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change lists the transfer of clean energy technology among measures that can control, reduce, or prevent greenhouse emissions. So that's one very important component. Where is the technology going to come from? And beyond the international players, I think also the governments have a role to play in funding and coordinating basic and high-level research on these technologies, and perhaps this is one area the different governments can come together to cooperate, right? Time is running out. There's actually two more questions, but actually I can sort of group them into a single question. First question, what role can SAC play in energy cooperation in the region? I think in the earlier presentation, there was already some mention of the role of SAC or the limitation of SAC. The second question is RCEP, which is the free trade agreement that was signed between a number of countries in Asia. And unfortunately, India, in the end, hasn't signed it. So the question is, what is the role of RCEP in ensuring energy cooperation in South Asia, given that all stakeholders in the region are not members? So I'll try to flip it the other way around, right? Ask a more general question. We haven't actually talked about another multilateral institution in the region, and that's BIMSTEC. Like, is there more potential for energy cooperation at the regional level through the BIMSTEC mechanism? So I'll start with Dr. Narayan, then Dr. Rahman, and then Dr. Huda. This will be our final question for this session. Thank you.
SARC, kind of is a stumbling organization. It does something for a few years and then it slows down, etc. But the South Asian Regional Initiative for Energy Cooperation is a very kind of a slow, low organization, but it has a lot of potential. And especially in energy, in the electricity side, if this trade cooperation document that is put out by the Central Electricity Commission, if that is taken up as a basis, it could form the basis of a cooperative framework for at least power sharing between these countries. I would call that just a beginning. I'm not taking the larger picture because I don't know. RCEP, India has decided not to be a partner in RCEP. And therefore, any RCEP-based initiatives, I am not really sure how India would integrate into RCEP-based initiative. Actually, I don't know. I mean, not really my area. I don't know too much about it.
Yeah, I think regarding RCEP, ASEAN plus 6. So this is a very deep integration FTA there where they talk about standard, they talk about non-tariff measures, they talk about public procurement. And India opted out because India, you see Indian trade deficit with the ASEAN country is, I think, $28 billion. India trade deficit with China is $50 billion, $54 billion. So huge trade deficit with ASEAN and plus China. That's been, ASEAN plus 6. So India is not ready, I understand. It could be understandable. And India, feel that India will, maybe increase their trade deficit with these countries. But I personally believe, and I really, I think India missing the opportunity. India really missing the trend. So India need to rethink. I understand maybe India's, of course, their competitiveness. You see India's trade GDP is $1.7 trillion. China is $13 trillion. It's 9 times higher. Of course, big country. So the trade deficit is but in economics, we don't actually bother about trade deficit. India is importing, it means they're also exporting to other countries. So they're importing a lot of, capital goods, all these things, and exporting. So I personally, as economist, I believe India missing the opportunity, not signing, with joining the RCF. And we understand India's, why, because of China and, their trade deficit could be increased, that definitely. But yes, BIMSTEC could be I think, better option for South Asian country because India is opted out from RCF and we excluding country, we know because we can't actually deal with this RCF. So many deep integration is there, so many rules, regulation there, so many standards there, so many non-tariff measures, elimination is there. So it's tough to cope with this, South Asian countries. But BIMSTEC could be the area where we can have some cooperation and win-win cooperation because that is the similarity is there, energy is there, power is there, and cooperation is there, technology is there. So we have platform is there also. So when we compare to RCEP, of course, BIMSTEC is much better to handle and much better to cooperate. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Huda?
Thanks, Dr. Len. I'll just keep my comments limited to SARC. I think Dr. Rahman is in a better position to talk about RCEP. So since the 2016 SARC summit was cancelled, SARC has essentially been quite dormant. But I don't really think that just because SARC isn't playing a dominant role in energy cooperation, that projects will not go through. So for example, BBIN has been doing really, really well. And this essentially is facilitated through joint working groups between the energy ministers of these countries. And even on the west of South Asia, we have several regional hydroelectric projects coming through, which are not really part of a broad regional organization. So we have 2TAP, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan coming together on a regional hydroelectric grid. And then we also have the CASA 1000 project, which is Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan coming together on another hydroelectric grid. So I really don't think that the inefficiency of SAARC is going to undermine energy cooperation, even though, of course, having a strong regional-wide organization would assist energy cooperation. But the reality is that due to the conflict between India and Pakistan, and some of the other countries in South Asia, SAARC has essentially become quite dormant. Even though the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, did raise the importance of using SAARC to counter the COVID-19 pandemic, I don't think that in the near future SAARC is going to play an instrumental role in energy cooperation in South Asia.
Okay, thank you very much. With that, we have actually run over time. Is there any one sentence statement from any one of you, or are we done? We are done, right? Okay, so I'd like to thank all the speakers for this very interesting session. And I also like to thank all my colleagues behind the scene who are working to make sure that all the technical details went according to plan with the webinar setup and everything. And finally, just so you know, Dr. Huda has a book out. It's a very interesting book. I would encourage you to go and take a look at it. And also, in addition to that, late last year, ESI and the Institute of South Asian Studies, we also published a book on sustainable energy transition in South Asia. So a lot of, it's an edited volume with a lot of contributions from people from different backgrounds covering these areas that we've talked about today. So with that, I would like to close this session. Thank you very much to all the speakers and also to the participants who tuned in. And we look forward to seeing all of you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Christopher.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Dr. Len. Thank you.
Bye.
See you. Bye.